And welcome to Southwest Shakespeare Company, a founding resident company of Mesa Arts Center. I'm Mary Way, the executive director. We're here today with another surround event for The Tempest by William Shakespeare. We are happy to be here with the director and creator of a movie that is streaming for your enjoyment during this Tempest season, Andrew Buckley, who's coming to us from Cape Cod, and a team of people from Phoenix, Arizona, most of whom are with Southwest Shakespeare Company, and one of whom, like Andrew Buckley, is a direct descendant of Stephen Hopkins, the character in question for today's discussion. Bruce Colville is a Phoenix resident, and Andrew Buckley is a Cape Cod resident. And the thing these two have in common is that they believe themselves to be the descendant of the man who is attributed to being the real Stephano in The Tempest. We also have with us Eric Banks, who plays Stephano in the current Southwest Shakespeare Company's production. And I'm finding you on the board, Megan Lindsay, who is also in The Tempest, playing one of the fates on the island. Megan is also an educator and was anointed by the director of this show to be our Shakespeare expert in this case. And on my board below Megan is our new artistic director at Southwest Shakespeare Company, Deborah Ann Bird. Welcome all of you to this discussion of Stephano and the film. In totality, the title of this film is Stephano, the true story of Shakespeare's Shipwreck. It's screened on PBS on the East Coast and in a number of places, and we'll have a couple of weeks to screen it on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. And one other thing called Twist. Is it Twist? Yes, it's Twist. So we'll be happy for you to screen that film and come back and watch this discussion, or watch the discussion and see the film afterwards. So I first believe, because there are many Native cultures involved in this conversation, many of whom would have been happy to be on this discussion, but it also is a scheduling thing. We'd each like to do a land acknowledgement, because in Arizona, we're in the middle of 23 sovereign Native nations. And in Cape Cod, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but a lot. As for us at Southwest Shakespeare, we're in the middle of the Pima, Maricopa, Salt River Indian community. We also derive a lot of the benefits of being in Arizona, like irrigation, from the forebearers of these tribes, and a community we don't know a lot about, but the Hohokam, that had a highly developed civilization and hundreds and hundreds of miles of waterways. We still benefit from those today. Andrew, how about in Connecticut or in Cape Cod?
Well, here, very specifically in the town of Chatham, where I grew up, this was the home of the Monomoyet tribe. They were associated not only with the up in the Massachusetts Bay area, but also this is the area of the Nauset, who were the eastern neighbors, and eventually became more associated with the Mashpee Wampanoag.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about Stephano. Stephen Hopkins, your forebearer. What gave you the idea to do this project, Andrew?
Well, we had been working on our public media series, Hit and Run History, which takes perhaps lesser known stories in history. And if it has a travel element, we try to be able to follow that. So our first project was actually following the first American voyage around the world, the Columbia Expedition, which left Boston in 1787. And we've been following that down to Cape Verde, the Falkland Islands, around Cape Horn in South America, and up to the West Coast and such. That's a very big project to be able to take a film crew around the world. However, when we were looking at the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival coming up, there was a lot going on in Massachusetts, and we realized it was an opportunity for me to be able to tell a story that I had grown up with. My mother, Lucy Jane Hopkins, who grew up on Hopkins Lane in East Orleans, we just knew that the family had been there for 400 years and was descended from the Hopkins family that had come over in the Mayflower. Now, if you say that around here, that and $2 will get you coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. It doesn't mean anything. So what? Everybody is, and they're probably 5 different ways. So it's not a big deal at all. However, it was just something that was known in my family and accepted, and also when I would get together on Thanksgiving with my Hopkins family, they'd say, well, he wasn't like the other ones. He was different. He got into trouble because he had a big mouth, and he also was special because he had been to North America before, and he was shipwrecked. And so these are a lot of things that I was kind of bombarded with as a kid. And then they bring in Shakespeare, and it was just kind of like, okay. So it just seemed like a good story because it had elements of travel. It had lesser known things, but at the same time, there was a lot of intersections in different places. And so I happened to mention it to somebody who worked at Mass Humanities. We had gotten a grant from them before, the Mass Humanities Foundation. And there was just enough that I said offhand that they said, that sounds like you could write a grant for that, for a pre-production grant. And that's what happened. Is we got the money, seed money, to be able to start the pre-production on this, and we ended up getting so many good interviews. It was just amazing. We could have probably made the film just from the pre-production interviews. So, and with that grant, then we got a letter of commitment from Rhode Island PBS to be able to bring it to broadcast in the southeastern New England region.
Congratulations. So as you were getting more and more in touch with your roots, what did you discover? Let's assume that some of the people watching this discussion haven't seen the film yet. Can you give us the basic outline of Stephen Hopkins' journey and why we think he's connected with the story of the Tempest?
Sure. He was born in the 1580s in southern England. Just growing up, his parents were tenant farmers, basically. Then he was orphaned, ended up getting a sort of religious education. And even though he had gotten married and had a small farm and such, he ended up signing on to a fleet that was going to rescue and resupply the failing Jamestown colony in Virginia in 1609. That fleet of ships was struck by a hurricane. It was scattered, and the flagship that he was on ended up almost sinking. It had sprung a leak, and they were getting ready to give up the ghost, really. And they spotted Bermuda. They ended up bringing the ship into there. And for the months that they were there, shipwrecked in Bermuda, a number of people decided that maybe they didn't want to go to a starving colony, and they didn't want to go home either. And that created all sorts of problems, including Stephen Hopkins himself getting brought up on charges of mutiny and condemned to death. His life was spared by, among other people, the intercession of former business partner of William Shakespeare's. And eventually they built ships themselves. They rescued themselves. They went to Virginia. He spent time in there. He returns to England a few years later. And then a couple of years after that, he's the only person on board the Mayflower who had been to North America before. He was basically their local expert. And that's why he was brought along. But also he had, in that time, he had gained a fair amount of wealth. We don't know how. And that's pretty much that. Is the story is that it was his presence there that helped when they landed in New England, because he actually had an idea on how to be able to communicate with the natives. And from there, we tell this story kind of backwards, though. We start off with this kind of mission of him and the Native American Squanto and Edward Winslow going on a diplomatic mission to Massasoit to be able to confirm the Treaty of Peace that they had. 50-mile walk, which we retrace, I should say, in the film, to be able to say, why is this person different? And that's what we're trying to do. Is it's not really telling the story of Stephen Hopkins nearly as much as it is telling the story of myself and my crew following the story of Stephen Hopkins, but more importantly about Atlantic exchange, because at the same time he was in North America, Pocahontas and Squanto were in England before the Mayflower ever set sail. And that's a bit of a revelation for a lot of people, because they think 1492, 1620, 1776, Civil War, and then we're basically done. World War I, World War II, and that's American history. And so it's that before period that's important, and the roles of Native Americans in England before the Mayflower ever set sail.
Fascinating. Just joining us is Dr. Susan Willis, who is the dramaturg for Southwest Shakespeare Company, and particularly on this Tempest project. Dr. Willis just left us in Arizona yesterday, and today she's appearing. Where are you?
Montgomery, Alabama. Home.
Montgomery, Alabama.
I pulled in 30 minutes ago.
Thank you for joining us.
Anytime.
Dr. Willis was a professor at Auburn until very recently, and we're taking full advantage of her retirement to bring her out west whenever we can.
It's a different campus. Yeah.
Also the dramaturg at Alabama Shakes, and an actor and scholar. Susan witnessed and has published her observations, the creation of 5 of the stories in the BBC's Complete Canon works, which is a very interesting log of events of how those stories were brought to film. So not unlike what we're talking about today, bringing history to film. It's the easiest, best kind of education for the viewer, though a great deal of work went into it on the filmmaking side. Yeah. Eric Banks plays Stephano in our play. Eric, as you're hearing the past of Stephen Hopkins, is there anything you can attach meaning to? Does anything resonate with you in terms of how you portrayed the character?
Actually, no, because when I was watching a documentary, I'm saying this guy, he's very intelligent. He's financially well off. And, that came in time. And he was very learned in scriptures and things of that nature, doing the Psalms for the churches. And I was thinking about Stephano, like, really, this character, to me, I know we can't answer for Shakespeare, but the way that Shakespeare wrote about him made him a drunken butler, and he was far from that. To me, Shakespeare did him didn't do any service for him, to be quite honest, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. From a historical perspective, a butler that's a derivation from bottler, someone who actually serves you alcohol.
Okay.
And so if he's the one who brings you alcohol, well, Hopkins came from a family of tavern keepers.
Okay. Yeah, so, they owned a tavern, correct?
Right, exactly. Right. But the other thing is, on the greater sense of it, we're looking at, it's basically the middle class. He's middle class. He's never going to get in that highly structured class system. He's never going to get any higher. So if you're William Shakespeare and you're writing this play for King James, who believes in the divine right of kings, mm-hmm. And you're going to write about somebody who challenges authority, you're going to make sure that he's a buffoon.
Okay.
And he's drunk, and and let's put that idea of challenging authority to bed right away in the most comedic way possible. In fact, if it wasn't for the comedy, he would just be a horrible person.
Right. Because your grandfather, he stood so strong on what he believed in that it almost got him killed. from your documentary, what you were saying. And I was thinking about Stephano, like, there's a contrast there. But of course, when you're writing plays, you have to use your imagination on some things.
Yeah. I mean, I could certainly say I don't think anybody in my family bears any ill will to William Shakespeare. I mean, it's just the fact that, however, I would say that my family does have a tendency to, as the English would say, speak out of turn. Be able to say, "Wait a minute, why? We're stranded in paradise now. Why in God's name would we be rushing to get out of here? And more importantly, why do I have to listen to you?" Yeah, not something you want to hear from a former farm boy. If you're the royally appointed governor.
Actually, one of the amazing things in there is that, as you said, my understanding is he was from the upper part of the lower third class, many of whom couldn't read. His family lived in Winchester for a while, and there was a fabulous school in Winchester, and the guessing is maybe somehow he got some reading education there, but that really was a dominant theme of his life. I mean, you talk about self-improvement and bringing yourself up. He had one of the most amazing lives given the era and the difficulty of just taking a stagecoach, 20 miles distant, and he's crossing the Atlantic at will and doing so many different things. But that's why he became the pastor's assistant on the Jamestown Relief Expedition, because he could read the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And that sort of dominated the rest of his life. Yep.
Yeah. Just I mean, that alone, and isn't that kind of an interesting way to think about that period of time, where as soon as you give people the ability to read scripture, especially on their own, oh God, they're going to have their own ideas.
Well, several of the people who wrote about him, Strachey and others, also said they tied reading and reasoning. And they said specifically that he knew, not only did he know the scriptures, but he could reason among the scriptures. And this is what led him down the primrose path. He could speak so well and convince other people. So he's the one who finally said, wait a minute, the governor doesn't have, his authority doesn't begin because we aren't in Jamestown, and the other people's authority aren't valid because we're shipwrecked. So let's just stay here. It's a hell of a great place to live.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to get kind of into the historical side of things a little bit more. We're talking around Christmas when reports come in that Stephen Hopkins is saying that the governor of Virginia, who's telling him to build these two ships, well, he's the governor of Virginia. We're in Bermuda, a desert island that is owned by and claimed by no one. They might as well have been in, Rio or China or something. They were in another country. You don't have the authority to tell me what to do. When we get to Virginia, you can. And if we're on the ship, then it's the captain, the admiral. But we're kind of in a no man's land. But the difference is that the governor, Gates, was really a military man. And he thought like a military man. And so the thing is, his job was to get everybody off to Jamestown. So we're going to build these two ships and we're going to rescue ourselves. And you're going to do what I say. And if you're not, you're challenging my authority. And to be honest, there was no government. There was nobody else to challenge him to say, no, you don't get to do that. So there was no civil authority in that case. So the thing is, but I do like the idea that this happened around Christmas time because, the English do have a habit of having that as a drinking holiday. So lips may have been a little bit loosened by bootleg alcohol.
So I want to bring our Shakespeareans into this. Maybe Megan and Deborah Ann and Susan, we can talk a little bit about equivocation and Shakespeare's knack for employing it in his plays to keep his head on his shoulders. Do you have any observations, writing for a monarch? Maybe Richard III is a good place to start. How do we remember Richard III? And how was he in reality?
I quote the late, great Pat Bradley, who was a medieval Scottish historian at Auburn and Montgomery, where I taught for 42 years. And she used to curse me when I would go down the hall to teach either Mackers or Richard III. And you could hear her from the floor below, and where I taught. And Richard III was a wonderful warrior, a powerful warrior. He was a great administrator. Henry VII stole his methods blind. Henry Tudor, who had no right, no primogeniture right to the crown of England at all. Richard, who, you get into this whole swamp of who's legitimate. It was Edward IV legitimate, is Edward V legitimate. It's this whole swamp of innuendo.
That sounds like a Shakespeare line, legitimate.
Yeah. God stand up for best. And but but to come down to it's always Renaissance now. Who writes the history? Henry VII paid historians to write the history of the Battle of Bosworth and that whole situation. And they made Richard, that's where you get Richard's scoliosis turned into this hideous hunchback, where he gets the withered arm. When all of that is created to enhance Henry VII and diminish Richard III. So and we weren't there. And if the king says this is the way it was, he blesses that history. You like your head on your shoulders? It's one of those things where Shakespeare is a playwright, is the story of a good administrator and a man who is worthy to serve well. A great play. Is that a good tragedy? Or is the story of a scheming, ambitious younger brother who's hunchbacked at a time when inner morality and outer shape were considered to be consonant? So if you're twisted outside, you're surely twisted inside. All of this was catnip Shakespeare. Plus, it's pretty good since the Tudors are on the throne. You're not going to go say, you're completely illegitimate, thank you. Or there you go with this head shoulders routine again. So Richard is is the ideal example for that. You get into, is the Tempest a history play? Probably not, no. But the fact that this is where you get into what contemporary criticism calls intertextuality and new historicism. It rubs up against all these wonderful things. And therefore, it's in conversation with it. And the conversation is really valuable. What we learn about the sea venture, about Bermuda, about the way they lived, about the access to alcohol, Eric, right? And just all these things is wonderful and informative in one way or another. Whether it says this is what Shakespeare wrote any of the characters to be. You've got power structures in the play. You've got, upstairs, downstairs. That's his society. That's Downton Abbey. That's, but I want to defer to everybody else. I was asked to speak first, but I'm not. Jump in, please.
Yeah, I think another interesting aspect of this equivocation, which is that Shakespeare is presenting this play before James I, and he was well known for having sort of this obsession with witchcraft and demonology and things like that, and that was very contentious, right, with things that were going on in the Catholic Church at the time. And so people did have to learn how to equivocate, and so that their consciences could be clear, and yet they could escape trouble with the law. And so I thought it was interesting that we see in the Tempest this image of Caliban as a demon, right? He's this creature of earth. He's this creature of a demon Sycorax. And yet, as Andrew, as you kind of draw out a little bit in your documentary, there's a sense in which we might see Caliban not as a demon, but as an other, right? As a stranger. And so we encounter him in the play as this, as a wicked character, but in the history, in the way that we see how the native tribes and the native peoples were treated, both from the English and from, those who were in, the colonists in the United States. It's not just an equivocation, I think, that maybe James could encounter, but there's almost a sense in which it's an equivocation with us too. That we have to encounter these ideas that maybe are uncomfortable to us, and they're easier to swallow if it's something that allows us a little bit of distance, but we're kind of forced to enter into.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because having other people on stage call him a monster or a demon, stage leaves us the ability to see for ourselves and to listen for ourselves and to make up our own minds by what we see. We hear their experience, but I mean, Eric, if we just said Stephano's a hopeless lush, is that his whole story?
No.
So it's pretty wonderful what how those issues on stage can empower us to see things, because we're told the otherness. But I've seen productions where I've loved Caliban best. He's been the guy that's been most honest. So it can go lots of ways. Deborah Ann, what do you think?
I needed to unmute. Sorry there. I'm just thinking about when I love all that you said, Susan, and all that you said, Megan. I'm just pretty much thinking about the power of creativity. The ability to just take something that is historical and add some things that, of course, we have to deal with the people that we're writing for. And so what does that do to the creative work? How do we use our creativity and save our heads from the people who we are writing for? How do we put some measure of truth and some measure of art to create what we call theater? I just find that interesting in all of the Shakespeare plays who have that particular vice. That's what I find most interesting.
We've had a question from Kathy Ferris, who attends the Shakespeare World Congress and is here in Arizona. And she said that the film isn't completely clear regarding Hopkins' religious persuasion. Could you be more specific about that? Which group of Protestants did he actually identify with? Do either of the descendants of Stephen Hopkins want to step in for Grandpa now?
Well, Bruce, why don't you go first?
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Well, actually, let me rephrase the question a little bit. There's a misunderstanding. The Jamestown expedition was not a particularly religious expedition. It was a commercial one. Mm-hmm. And the people on the first expedition were, as a matter of fact, aristocrats. They weren't people who knew how to plow and grow things and do anything. They thought they were going to land there and have the Indians as their servants. And of course, that's why it went so foul. The Mayflower expedition, we always think of in terms of separatists who came were booted out of England, came from Leiden, picked up some people in England, but only half of the people on the ship were religiously oriented. The other half were, again, going as a commercial venture. And even though Stephen Hopkins was the guy who read the scriptures for the pastor in Jamestown, etc., he was not one of the religious people. He went as a commercial venture. He was going for 3 years of indentured servitude in Jamestown and 7 in Plymouth, at the end of which they were divvying up the land and the cattle, and this was going to be wealth. As Andrew said, when Stephen joined the Mayflower expedition, he had gained significant wealth in there. He was the largest family aboard the Mayflower. He had 2 servants in his employ, and he did that because he got to build the biggest house and get the largest share when things were divvied up. So he was not, I don't think, a member of a particular religious sect as a believer. That was not what drove him. He was more looking for self-betterment and a new opportunity in the new world.
Yeah, and as far as and we did kind of touch upon this, but it's trying to talk about the differences in early 17th century religious sects in England is a real PhD thesis.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say that at the time, there's the Catholic Church, which was, not in favor at the time because of Queen Elizabeth. And so then there was the Church of England, who were Protestants, or at least nominally Protestant. And then there were people like the Puritans, who were, I think I've referred to them as Protestant Taliban, because they were wanting to really purify things in the English church and get rid of all Catholic influences. And then you had the Brownists, who are otherwise known as anti-conformists. And the difference was that, and that's what the people, the religious community that started on the Mayflower were, they were separatists. They were just wanting to start their own congregations, elect their own ministers, and so forth. And so they were trying to separate from that. And that's a lot of what happened in New England, is those little white churches, in lots of little towns, having their own, centered around the church and stuff like that. So there was a difference between the Puritans, who actually persecuted the separatists, because the Puritans, of course, they didn't want to have any sort of dispute on either side of them. They were absolutely right, and they were theocrats, and it was a very top-down sort of thing. It's like they just wanted to be in charge. Hopkins was not of that religious community, because that community on the Mayflower was from north of London, and he was from a totally different area. He was in Hampshire, in the south of England, but it was believed that he was more of an anti-conformist, Brownist, named after a very outspoken separatist leader. These Brownists, who basically were even more extreme, which was basically, what's the best way to be able to characterize this? Get away from me. Just let me do my own thing. And, and that is the problem in that particular society, because if the head of the church in England is also King James, and King James is very much a ruling by divine right, he's head of the church too. So you don't challenge his doctrine as well. So we could say, Catholic Church here, Church of England, Puritans, separatists, anti-conformists, way over here. And so we believe he was way over there on that side of things. And so that kind of tracks with his whole attitude at while he was in Bermuda, which is to say, you don't have any authority over me, and to the governor, but at the same time he's basically saying the same thing. You don't have any authority over me religiously. He kind of rejects that. So it's almost along the lines of what he didn't believe more than what he did.
What denomination of church was he married in? You were in, you went to that church, and I'm trying to recreate. It looked more Anglican than Puritan to me.
It was the Whitechapel. When we say Whitechapel in London,
mm-hmm.
That was made famous, a couple centuries later by Jack the Ripper.
Yes,
it's the Whitechapel. So St. Mary's Church, which of course at the time, only one church was sanctioned.
Yes.
So therefore, he was married in an Anglican church, but since all churches had to be Anglican, he was married in Church of England because it wouldn't have been recognized otherwise. That was his second marriage. The first one, of course, was he was married in Hursley, which also was that's All Saints Church. So of course,
that's the church I remember seeing in the film.
Yeah.
So small point of order. this could potentially cause a fight. But the Anglican communion is actually Catholic, and I know that's hard for people to understand, but there is Roman Catholic and there is Anglican Catholic, there's Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, but they all come from that apostolic tradition of Peter or Paul, but that Peter as the head of the church, and then all these other things, just like languages, a lot like languages, these different denominations of Catholic means universal. So other denominations started coming to the fore in the United Kingdom, but technically they were not Protestants. Lutherans were Protestants, and later the Methodists became sort of the official low church of England, but the Anglican church the Church of England would always be, That said, James was from Scotland. Actually, Queen Elizabeth today was Church of Scotland because her mother was. She was not expecting to be queen and suddenly found herself the head of the Church of England. I don't know if this brings anything to bear with the discussion that's going on today with Stephen Hopkins, but it is an interesting tangle. Now, looking at Andrew, I am reminded of Christopher Marlowe. Crazy connection. You are looking like Christopher Marlowe today. And he lived in a town called Canterbury, which is famous for an older version of English, the Canterbury Tales and the pilgrimages. And so we have this extremely Mecca style pilgrimages going around to these holy places in England. Extremely reverential, unless you read the Canterbury Tales and then you realize they were not as reverent as we had thought. But we have these Puritans in the city of London. Do any of our historians want to talk about the trouble that caused for Shakespeare and possibly Stephen Hopkins, and maybe how this ties into the portrayal of Stephano as not a particularly learned person, and perhaps not as ambitious as he was, but what is the message of the servant who is suddenly released from bondage? What is human nature? What does Stephano want to do with his liberty? How does he see himself on the island? So I'm going to throw that out there. There are 5 things you could pick up on. What do you see?
Megan?
Yeah, that was a lot to throw out, Barry. I mean, first of all, I'm intrigued to go back to the point, which I actually, as an Anglican, really appreciate that you did say that, Mary, because I think it is important to understand that even though the king was separating from the Roman Catholic Church, Anglicans did not see themselves as different, right? And so to be a nonconformist was really to be very much in a minority, right? And it was to be very much of defining yourself against somebody as opposed to defining yourself in favor of something in particular. And so what that would have meant, I can only imagine how mistrusting people must have been of one another, not knowing whether from day to day the people that they were interacting with could have in some way destroyed their lives, right? To tell the authorities something, you could lose your job, you could lose your home, those kinds of things. But I also wonder, did the separatists, did someone like Stephen Hopkins, did he feel that, or was he largely trying to find a way to simply make his way through, regardless of what was going on around him? And how common was that with the other separatists? Maybe another way to put it is, did they feel like they were a second class, or did they feel like maybe they had been freed into something else?
If I may, one of the things, and this gets beyond the realm of the film, is that, you know, if anyone looks into the story of the Plymouth colony in Mayflower, they hear about Miles Standish and William Bradford and John Carver and William Brewster and so forth, and Edward Winslow. You don't hear about Stephen Hopkins. Now, you know, not that wealth should count for everything, but, you know, he was the wealthiest guy who was there, or one of the wealthiest, had the largest family. You know, he was on the governor's council. There were 5 people. There was the governor, and then he had a council of advisors, and so he was on that. So he's very prominent, and yet we don't know about him. And that's partly because later on he got in trouble for I won't go into it, but he was keeping a tavern in Plymouth, and he was serving alcohol, you know, on the wrong days for the wrong price to the wrong people. So and then, you know, he had other troubles, and he tried to leave Plymouth. He tried to move out, and they and move down to the Cape, down where I am, and they called him back and made him stay there. And, you know, the whole arc of this guy's life is to get away from these structures that want to hold on to him. And, you know, he basically, you know, was told, no, I'm sorry, you have to move back to Plymouth and live with these people that you apparently have grown very tired of. Now, you know, if we think about that, it's very libertarian, actually. And to a great degree, you know, and there is this streak of, I'll say, small L libertarianism throughout American thought. If you go live in Europe or spend time, you know, with Europeans, you know, their attitude is, if you're going to open up a business, you have to go ask permission, get a license for something, whereby we just say, hey, you know, I'm going to go and start selling soda out of the back of my car, you know, at a game somewhere. And sure, I should be able to do that until someone stops me. And so, you know, but, you know, again, you know, it's like, Eric, you know, you think about it, is that you've got, imagine how crazy someone looks when they think they want to do something different. Of course, they're going to look like a clown. They're going to look like a buffoon. Oh, they must be drunk, you know, those sorts of things. So, you know, all those people who go and do something different, of course, they're going to be called nuts, and everybody's going to tell stories about them. And some of them might be true, but most of them are just going to be wildly exaggerated. So, you know, I think that's really it, is that it's just, you know, the stories you tell about people who want to break with things. And certainly, you know, I've been called, you know, in my life, and someone's called me a nonconformist. And I said, no, I'm an anti-conformist. And I didn't even know that term existed religiously. It was just the fact of, you know, this idea that you just don't want to, it's like the Huckleberry Finn thing, which is you just got to light out for the territories.
Light out for the territories.
Exactly. Just get away from Miss Polly and her scratchy clothes.
You know, let me add a thought too about keeping in mind it wasn't planned this way, but the way the Mayflower wound up, it was sort of half and half, religiously oriented people, separatists, and non-religiously oriented people who were basically on a commercial venture. When they actually reached Cape Cod, remember, they didn't just suddenly land. They tried to go south because where the actual patent was going to be more down toward New York. They couldn't make it because of the rough waters off where Andrew lives. And there they are deciding what to do. And one of the most amazing moments, I think, in American history is the creation of the Mayflower Compact. Because you've got this group of 42 or 3 males aboard the ship. They're desperate to get off the ship. They're desperate because they're way late in the season. It's not a good situation. And the question comes up, how are we going to govern ourselves? What's going to happen? How are we going to work? And somehow that group, with a few law books and other things and a couple Bibles, wrote the original master document of the American experience. It's an incredible document that they created there. And that actually governed their lives. And it's a relatively secular document. The religious people didn't lord it over the separatists didn't lord it over the commercial people, or vice versa. And there were issues that continued. And then when the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts, in Boston, and as Andrew already said, they persecuted the separatists. And they were very well funded, by the way. When they showed up in Boston, they had fleets and money and lots of people and animals. And, the poor Plymouth guys were sort of out in the woods. But that moment is so interesting because it wasn't planned that way. It happened almost by accident because the people funding the voyage didn't have enough separatists to fill the ship. So they got other people to sign on, like Stephen Hopkins. But then they had to decide how we're going to live and how we're going to be governed. And they didn't just say we're going to do it the way the Bible said it. They created a compact that is truly one of the most amazing documents in certainly American history.
Yeah, and did include the servants as well. And the idea, it wasn't just the wealthy or whatever. It was every male at least. But the thing is that it's been put forward that Stephen Hopkins had a role in that, because here was this ship 11 years after he got into trouble in Bermuda, shipwrecked there. Here we are. He was supposed to be they're supposed to go to the mouth of the Hudson River. Instead, here they are on Cape Cod. We're outside of our charter. We're not where we're supposed to be. I know this story, and I know how it ends, which is we don't get things squared away right now, we're going to have a problem again. Mm-hmm. And he didn't sign up for that. He didn't sign up for it the first time either. And so the idea is we're going to all consent to form, we're going to have a government based upon the consent of the governed. And that is a very, that's a very New England town meeting sort of structure, which, I'm used to going, where we run our towns by an open town meeting, which is once a year. Everybody in town comes together and passes the bylaws and the budgets and everything else like that. And that's just how it is. And, we have 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and almost all of them are run the exact same way. And it's the idea of we're all going to come together, and, there's no one person over us. So there's not a small, theological group that's going to be lording it over us either. And so, again, that's the idea of anybody should be able to get up and say their piece. What a radical, crazy idea, and they must be drunk.
So when we talk about the formation of these communities, the film is very careful to include all of the native and First Nation people who were already there. So we think we're creating something, and then there are other groups of people who think we already created that. It was in existence when you came. So Andrew, will you address a little bit the kind of investigation and care you went to? On the film, you have a descendant of Squanto. Just elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, it was very important to me when making this film that we this could have easily been my white ancestor worship, and I didn't want it to be that. There are books written about any number of people who came over on the Mayflower, and that's I didn't need to be doing anything like that, because I grew up with this idea, this story that was handed down to me, oral tradition, that he was different. And so what made him different? And one of the things that I was told by my mother is, when the natives came to Plymouth, they stayed at his house. They stayed over. Well, that's an unusual thing. So there had to be some sort of relationship there. And so the first thing I did when I was starting off with this film, even before I had gotten that grant from Mass Humanities, was I went to a screening of a film called 1614, Kidnapped. And that was made by Paula Peters, who's a member of the Wampanoag tribe. She's a filmmaker and journalist. And I went watched the film. It was about the capture of Squanto in 1614 and how he was brought to Spain and was supposed to be sold into slavery, but was instead, he was rescued and made his way to England and such. And so the thing is that I spoke to Paula afterwards. I went up to her and I introduced myself and I said, I'm thinking about making this film about my ancestor, and I've been told that he was different partly because of his relationship with the natives, and I want to know if there's any stories that you have or any insights. And so we scheduled an interview. And she said, do you want to interview the young man who plays Squanto in the film? I said, absolutely. So we interviewed her, then we interviewed him. And afterwards, to get his perspective on how the tribe sees Squanto. And at the end of it, I said, we're going to be taking this 50-mile walk, recreating this thing that Squanto and Stephen Hopkins and Edward Winslow took. Do you want to come with us? And he said, absolutely. And and that's what was captured, because it brought our crew together. We were able to get his perspective on things, not only the perspective of what it was like to be Squanto in London, in the 16 teens, but also when we went down to Jamestown, to Virginia, and spoke with members of the Pamunkey tribe, and that was rewarding for me to be able to see Warren Taylor from the Pamunkey tribe, meeting with Chris Wessling, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, and them, they're the either end of the Algonquin peoples on the East Coast, and just to be able to go and talk to them about Pocahontas and then go to Waffle House and have lunch and that was really great to be able to hear about his experiences, Chris's experiences, and all the rest. It was very enriching for me as a filmmaker.
Is there any oral history among the natives about Stephen Hopkins that would make him outstanding or different from the other members who were in Plymouth?
I didn't pick anything up on that specifically about him, and the thing is, as well, is that Squanto eventually went to go live in Plymouth with the English. He was on the outs with Massasoit, and then soon after died. And in fact, he died on a trip to the Monomoyet village, which is like 2 miles away from here. So he actually died. The story is that we kind of know generally where he died, but we don't know exactly where he's buried. But Chatham is able to claim Squanto in that regard as well. So, but the thing is, there's nothing specific. Then I didn't get challenged on the ideas either. So it's believed that he had a special relationship, and but it's not quite talked about, because at the time, the way that history went, having a too cozy relationship with the natives was not necessarily a good thing.
Well, he certainly, when he wound up in Jamestown, they had been, they'd run afoul of the natives for several years, and the natives you couldn't leave the stockade or they'd kill you. And somehow he was clearly involved. The marriage of Pocahontas was the big thing, but he was somehow involved. And as you said before, he was regarded as an expert in not only having been to the new land, but having had some understanding and relationship with the natives. And he did, clearly. But it's a shame. Reading was such an important part of his life, but he didn't write very much, so far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And that's a shame.
And the records of the Virginia Company burned as well, so we don't have much of anything at all. And so, but the thing is, what we're able to do, because we had no records of what was going on in Jamestown at the time, or records from him, or letters, or whatever else, is we filled in that blank by talking about Pocahontas. And so that is really helpful, because we can use many stories here. We can see how his life intersects with Pocahontas, and so we get to tell her story, and then later on they're both in England at the same time, and when she passes away, and we start thinking about the ideas of when Pocahontas died on her way leaving London, and was buried in Gravesend. Stephen Hopkins and Squanto were both in London. Who went to her funeral?
I have a question about the language in the documentary. I particularly had a great time just listening to some of the things that they were saying. Of course, some of the language was from the Tempest, but like that section when the young man was sitting on the rocks, and another part where I heard them say, "We lodged in the open air, for houses had they none." I just always get really turned on by language that's like that, because it's our language, but the words are like turned a little backwards and things. So as I was thinking about it, I was wondering, where did you find or get those pieces of information? Was it written down in someone's in a book? Did someone leave a log or a journal of some kind? And who was it? I'm trying to remember. I was thinking that it was your ancestors' words that were being read, but I'm not completely sure. Where did that language come from?
Well, as far as the account of the wreck, that was William Strachey, who had been who had owned a piece of the Blackfriars Theatre in London, and so he was on board at the time. He was made the secretary to the Virginia Company on his way. So, and he had a background. You know, he had written a poem published or something like that. So he was a Shakespeare wannabe, and he just happened to be writing an account on it. So you've got this man of letters writing this account, and so that's what
I think it was. He did a great job.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then on the other hand, we have Mort's Relations, which included a journey to Pokanoket, and so we were able to use the words of. It was probably written by Edward Winslow, one of the three men on that journey, and so to be able to so again somebody who. He wasn't Shakespeare caliber, but certainly there was some time to be able to think about how to write that, and exactly. And Neil McGarry, who had been at the time the head of Bay Colony Shakespeare, he's the one reading that. So we wanted to get somebody who, had a Shakespeare background to be able to read these words and put the proper emphasis, and he did a magnificent job.
Yes, he did.
Maybe this is a good time to mention that the director of our Tempest, Ingrid Sonicson, she can't get in for some reason to the thing, but she's listening. So congratulations, Ingrid, wonderful production for our company. But I want to ask you and Eric Banks this question. Do you think that Stephano is ambitious?
Yes.
And how do you know that?
Well, number one, as far as from the play The Tempest, having this opportunity to be king, I mean, that's ambition right there alone. Because just because he ran into Caliban and Caliban wants to serve him, he can be like, no, I don't want to. No, we good. You don't need to serve me. I don't need to be on that level. So to want to even have the notion, oh, I could be king. Yeah, that takes ambition.
Now, can I piggyback on that question? Because I was going to ask you, what is his journey back? What is Act 6 for Stephano? Your Stephano. Does he keep buddling? Does he go back and just, okay, that was a nice, kind of one-day vacation, and now I'm back to uncorking the wine? Or has he suffered a sea change as well? Does he see the world in any different way for you?
I think he does. Yeah. For me, to ask that question, yes, because you always want, when you think about what could have been, your mindset is not going to stay back where it was before, because now I think it even leads to even more ambition. Like, you know what? There's something to this. Maybe I could be more than just a butler. So yes.
So here's the question I want to ask Andrew and Bruce. Well, and maybe, Andrew, you've studied this more. Of the characters that survived the crash of the Sea Venture, Stephano, or Stephen Hopkins, is immortalized above and beyond other characters that were also on the Sea Venture. Do we see other characters in the story that resemble passengers on that ship? B, if it's only Stephen Hopkins that's being remembered in effigy, what was the characteristic? We've seen a character in the play that is ambitious, and monarchs can see that if they're gone, their butlers are thinking about power. But we've also intoxicated him, so he's sort of rendered neutral. How do you think that relates to your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and why?
Go ahead, Bruce.
No, you start this time, Andrew.
Okay, well, there's a lot that I can address there. As far as people who were immortalized, there's a way I want to answer this question, but instead I'm going to answer the way I'm going to try to answer your question, but I've probably got something to throw in.
Oh, that's okay. You can wing it.
Well, no, I will say that Admiral Summers, because there were basically there were two poles of power when the Sea Venture wrecked. It was the admiral of the ship, Summers, and there was Gates, the governor, or the governor, appointed governor. And so once they got on land, Gates tried to, had his own thing. But the thing is, they built two ships. One, was salvaged from the wreck, and the other was completely.
So just to clarify, they built two ships out of the wreckage of the Sea Venture.
No, they built one ship out of the wreckage of the Sea Venture, and they built, and that was Gates doing that.
I see.
Summers decided to get his people away, his sailors away from Gates, because Gates was a military man and tried to run his whole operation. I'm in charge. We're on land. You're in charge when we're at sea. And the thing is that you can't start knocking off your sailors when they misbehave, because then how are you going to get off the islands? What are you going to sail? Who's going to sail these ships? And so Summers went, and the second ship, the Patience, was Patience. It was named after it. I think it was because he was trying to get his people away. They built their own ship, completely using the resources of the island, and the only piece of metal on the entire ship for Summers' ship was a screw that Gates was willing to give him. So I mean that's the level of diversion. And so who would he in the play represent? Because he was much more indulgent of his people. Gonzalo, perhaps the older man, because Summers was older, and so the one who talks about wouldn't it be better if we were mankind living basically in community and such like that, much more among other things. Summers returns to Bermuda, dies there actually, and they didn't call it Bermuda at the time. Afterwards they call it the Summers Isles. And so the whole idea, he's buried there, in fact. And so the thing is that, he represents a different pole, a different attitude towards how are we going to live in this paradise, and rather than some top-down hierarchy. And so I would say that. I've also, now I'm going to answer the question the way I would like to, which is to say, that if you look at popular culture, we've had the Tempest, just like a lot of other plays, turned into modern ideas. And the one that comes to mind in popular culture is Forbidden Planet, which is the Tempest in outer space, with young Leslie Nielsen and Robbie the Robot and such. So that's good, but there's a better one. Because not everybody's seen Forbidden Planet, but they have seen a half-hour sitcom with a 3-hour tour with Gilligan and the skipper and a professor and Marianne and such. The Gilligan's Island is the Tempest, told in a 3-year span of time, a half hours at a time. But if you think about it, and it tracks. It tracks pretty well, but most importantly, that would mean that Stephano is skipper, who's always fun when he's drunk.
That's a wonderful point. And in fact, I was reading, I don't remember who it was, but there was a dialogue going back and forth about to what extent was Strachey's diary of the wreck on Bermuda, used Izzy Stephano and so on and so forth. And one of the arguments made was, do you know how many reports of shipwrecks were available at that time? I mean, hundreds and hundreds of them. And so if you are writing, and given the fact that Shakespeare didn't write just all by himself in a vacuum, he had to follow certain rules, otherwise the king would never produce it, et cetera, et cetera. He had to worry about who was paying for the thing. He had a lot of issues to deal with. But yeah. I do, from a lot of reasons, I do think that Stephano is based on Stephen Hopkins. Yeah. But the original question was, what about other people? How come nobody else has come to the fore, et cetera, et cetera? And I think it goes back to that issue. There's been a lot of shipwrecks in this world. And name 5 people other than Pocahontas you can name who were at Jamestown. You know, we don't know a lot of those people. And I personally, the more I dig into Stephen Hopkins, and I'm new at this, I envy Andrew, who grew up as a Hopkins. I was born in New Hampshire, and I have relatives all over Cape Cod. But we always said we're an old New England family. I owe this to my wife. One of her hobbies is genealogy. Mm-hmm. So about 15 years ago, she decided to turn her attention to me. And within weeks, she had me nailed to 5 or 6 of the Mayflower families. And we went to the Mayflower. What do they call it? Basically the headquarters of the Mayflower thing in Plymouth. And I was out in the car on a business call, and Lucia goes walking in all puffed up like goes back to something Andrew said before. You know, if you're on the side of, I know about this, everybody's a relative. If you do the math, geometric progression of those 25 families, something like 30 million Americans are related to somebody. Yeah. But my wife goes in, it's a funny story. She goes up to the desk and she basically says to this woman, my husband is related to 5 different families on the Mayflower. And the woman basically said, at that time, remember, if you wanted to get married, your choice was one of the other 24 families, the Indians or the woodland animals. So get in line. And she was just totally deflated by the whole thing. But the more you dig into it, you realize there's a lot of wonderful stories that only close-knit people like us have. I mean, Stephen Hopkins was one of the oldest people aboard the ship. He was in his 40s, which was elderly by those standards. And he went back to his roots and kept a tavern. And Andrew was being polite to our relative. But also, I want to back up and say, even though I said, isn't it a shame Stephen read, but he didn't write much? But don't forget, in that era, everybody wrote. There were not 1, but 2 diaries kept of Bermuda. There's loads of stuff from Jamestown and Plymouth. My goodness, this Mort's, not Revenge, whatever. There's a lot of information that came from a lot of different people. And so what we know about Stephen is you go and you read the court records, and he got in trouble because he ran a tavern in his house and he broke some laws. But the interesting thing is, at the end of the day, Miles Standish was the executor of his will. His house at the crossroads of Plymouth, in the center of town, his house was directly opposite the governor. And he was very, very well regarded by the other people in Plymouth, et cetera, et cetera. But other people wrote their diaries and wrote other things. And so those are the things that survive. But thank heavens to his descendants, right, Andrew? We're fighting for Stephen all the way.
Well, the thing is, it's said that 1 million Americans are descended from Stephen Hopkins. Yeah. And that's because he was prolific. I mean, the family's prolific. And so, you know, there is that. It's just the fact is, you know, I look at it this way. It doesn't make me special. It doesn't make, you know, it doesn't make anybody special to be descended from anybody. However, but if you go back, you will find some interesting stories. You may find people who are completely horrible. In fact, you're bound to find somebody horrible if you go far enough back. It's just the odds. But the thing is that I think the thing that I like about this particular story is, you know, we're talking about a tavern, a frontier tavern. That's a place where people come from all walks of life. And again, you know, they meet each other. That's where cultural exchange happens. And I like the idea. You know, I grew up, you know, it was my mother's a great entertainer and host. And, you know, that idea of welcoming people in to the table, sharing, you know, big seafood meal, especially when we have friends coming from the Midwest or something. It's like to be able to make sure that people are well fed, have a very good time, and tell lots of stories. And that's the sort of legacy that I I hope it's a long family tradition, and this film is just that made into video.
So do you believe that Stephen Hopkins was ambitious? Do you think he drank too much, or what was the strategy? What was the strategy? So how did Shakespeare find out about him, and why would he want to write about him?
Well, right. So the thing is that Strachey wrote when everybody got off of Bermuda, went to Jamestown, and appeared basically back from the dead, because it was assumed after 9 months that everybody on the Sea Venture had been lost at sea, and all of a sudden they appear in Jamestown. And the long story short is word got back to England. At that point, the Jamestown colony was nearly abandoned because it was such a horrible. They just couldn't get out of their own way. They couldn't do anything right. They couldn't get along with the natives, and they couldn't feed themselves. So the thing is, word got back. Strachey wrote a letter to a lady. It wasn't meant to be a private letter. Word got out. Oh my God, the Sea Venture is saved. Divine providence. England must have a colony and take over North America. And so it's been ordained by this miracle. And certainly the Virginia Company, used the PR value of that. They saw it and used it very cynically. But the thing is that it was a sensation through England that the Sea Venture had been saved. It was a shipwreck in which everybody survived, and everybody thought was lost, all these famous people. And so at Strachey, you just happen to have someone on board who could write a really good account of everything that happened. Mm-hmm. So therefore, Shakespeare got a hold of that, and no different from an episode of Law and Order. Let's pull something from the headlines. What's the biggest story around? Well, I'm going to go out. I'm going to write my last play, go out with a bang. I'm going to get this miracle that happened and talk about this strange new world as well.
So you think that Stephen Hopkins was something of a celebrity when he came back to England?
I don't know about that, because by the time he actually got back, which was several years later, one wonders if what would have happened. I think that he would have come back as a celebrity, not because of the Tempest per se, but I think that he was probably much sought after for his intellectual property, what he knew. He had firsthand knowledge of what North America was like, and that's why probably he was probably recruited to go on the Mayflower, of all things, because there's this guy in London who isn't far from where our congregation is, and he knows about North America. Wouldn't he be a really good person to have on board?
Yeah,
and part of our colony.
Actually, his landlord was one of the financial backers, and I think that was one of the connections. But keep in mind, again, the times and the tenor and everything. Strachey's first draft was available in manuscript form in the theater, etc., and it was relatively unexpurgated. I mean, it told the real story of how bad it was and other things. The draft that actually was published a couple of years later was totally changed because the financial guys were trying to tell everybody this is a Garden of Eden. Everybody wants to go over there. Yeah. So the bad stuff, that much of which Stephen had helped fix, was not what the public knew at that time. Yep. It's kind of like Russia today. You can't say Ukraine and bombing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was very carefully worded sorts of things, but again, it was all about raising money for business, because Jamestown was a business. And so, but as far as Stephen Hopkins is concerned, I think maybe people would have associated with him with that, the idea of Stephano, but clearly not too much. He was still doing pretty well for himself under the circumstances, and but most importantly, if you have a company that is investing in North America and you want to make money from it, Stephen Hopkins was probably in demand. He's walking around. We need his information just like we need Squanto's information. We need that. You have value on what's between your ears.
So I'm fascinated to learn that he actually went to the banqueting hall in Whitehall and saw a performance of The Tempest.
Well, the Strachey, we talked about the idea that it would have been possible for Strachey to be able to do that. Hopkins would not have been able to because he was still stuck in Jamestown. But Strachey got back to London in time to be able to go, if he had been able to see a performance of the Tempest at the banqueting hall. But it had been performed smaller, I believe at the Blackfriars beforehand. But the idea that Strachey he would have been himself a bit of a celebrity because he wrote this account and such. But you can also, hear the grinding of teeth that here is this failed writer whose account was picked up by Shakespeare, and there it is being performed for King James.
Oh. Yeah.
I'm sure he wasn't bitter at all.
I was under the impression that Strachey was kind of hired to be the travel writer. So his accounts were designed to be published as good reports.
Yep.
After they were sanitized, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. But the thing is that he got a lot more of a story than he bargained for. But I think we're all lucky that this guy just happened to be on board and captured all of this, because if it wasn't for Strachey's letter, I don't think the Tempest would have happened. And I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, but I think it's fair to say that if that ship had sunk, or if he had not gone along, I don't think you would have this. It wouldn't have been out there.
So let me ask the people who are involved with the production of The Tempest, or actually the historians, how about that? Do you think that Shakespeare could have possibly been involved in a, maybe just peripherally in a scheme to sort of make it known that by mentioning Stephano, that even though we're in the Mediterranean and talking about Milan and things like that, that this enchanted island was somehow a part of the New World, that it would have, by mentioning this one character, it would have lit people's imaginations about what travel or living in a new place, that there would be magic across the seas. What do you think?
Sorry, go ahead. Please go first.
Go ahead.
I would have to say there's so much speculation about what Shakespeare actually thought, right? What we have are simply his plays. And I thought Deborah Ann brought up a really important point, is this idea of art and creativity, and how much of that comes from a conscious desire to produce a particular artifact, and how much of that is almost our channeling of something that's greater. And there's no doubt about the fact that the New World was in people's mind. It was in their imagination. But I don't know. I guess in my experience, I'm watching Keith play Prospero, and I'm watching our Mirandas, and I'm watching the actual human beings that I know playing these roles. And I've seen The Tempest many times, other human beings playing these roles, and they're never played the same way. They're unique in every moment. And there's something incredible that happens because it's so unique every time, that we get these little laughs as Keith he sounds like my husband talking to our daughters when he's talking to Miranda, and there's a boy that's come in the house and we're going, oh my gosh, why? As a parent, I relate so much to that. And yet if I peel back those layers from my personal experience, and I think of the things that Prospero is wrestling with in his own soul, about his will to power, and how he can reconcile betrayal and those kinds of things. That's a totally different story. And that he needs that island experience in order to do that. He has to sort of be taken out of his own life in order to see some of those things. I feel like there's a richness in Shakespeare generally, and especially in this fantasy tale, that lends itself to so many different interpretations. I would have a hard time saying that I think, yes, Shakespeare was saying, let's, we're talking about the new world, guys. Let's start imagining what the new world is like. But I think that what was going on in Western history at the time, and history in Europe, means that it became possible through the experiences, that, the accounts that, for example, the documentary brings up.
Thank you. And Susan, Shakespeare's nearing retirement at this point. Do you think there was any product placement in this play?
You mean, you better get this now because I won't be here to write another one?
Or someone says, could you possibly make travel look good in your play?
Well, all the romances have travel and shipboard scenes or shipwrecks. It's part of what his last 4 plays are doing. So this is not the only shipboard shipwreck scene that we have in Shakespeare, and certainly the last ones. That's very much a part of it in some way or another. They don't start with it, but this one does. And so it's part of but the fact that he doesn't put us in the new world, but just drops the word Bermoothes in there. Bermuda. He lets us do the work. If it's the talk of the town, you don't have to dot the I's and cross the T's. You lay out a story about a shipwreck, an island, an undiscovered island. An uninhabited island, with people on it. And you drop one word in and let people go. Let them go to whichever island they want to be on. And a lot of them will at least swing through Bermuda, the islands that have been discovered by Columbus. The Spanish, the Portuguese, and the English, as they've been sailing around for 120 years then. And it's really exciting to watch what his faith in the power of the imagination, I think is just build it and they will come, or they will sail.
So we talked briefly about Puritans. Maybe tell the little story about why the Globe is on the South Bank and who the Globe's neighbors were and what Shakespeare was up against, and Stephen Hopkins as well, having come from the same culture at about the same time. These people who are thinking, a little outside of the box, what were they up against?
Megan, you want to do that one? Or?
I don't think I would actually know how to answer that question.
Yeah.
Just how it got to South Bank. The Burbages owned the building of the theater, the first custom-built theatrical space in London. There have been a lot of inns that had been housing plays and all, but they owned the building. They didn't own the land it was standing on. And when it got to be popular in the Curtain, it's like used car lots, they built right next to each other. So the Curtain, the second purpose-built theater in London, was built right next door to the theater. And so the landlord upped the land rent astronomically and went out of town, and the Burbages and the people, Shakespeare was a part of the company at this point, and said, okay, we're going to pay all this ad infinitum and it's going to just keep going up, or we own the wood. So they went and bought property in South Bank, which was the new theater district. The Swan, the Rose, the bull baiting pits, the bear baiting pits it was the entertainment center because it was outside of the jurisdiction of the city fathers. So it was a kind of get away with entertainment free, or at least freer zone. And so they bought property down there and stored they took the theater down while the landlord was out of town. Just took it down, the last nail, everything. But then they had to kind of put it up in the same shape. And there's some wonderful videos on YouTube right now about the theater and the Globe being the only polygonal theaters in London. Most of the others were square or rectangular, but they had to make it polygonal again because that was the size of the lumber they had. So it's like, okay, we rebuild a polygon, and that's pretty fun. But they joined, and their neighbors were pubs, inns, and brothels. And most of the land the brothels were on was owned by the Bishop of Winchester. That's why in one of the plays he calls the working women of London Winchester geese. That's what they were nicknamed, because everybody knew the bishop rented out his land to madams to run, to allow working women to
keep
work.
them off the streets.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of good stuff about that theater and how but that's where they all became, the businessmen. That's how they made money. Shakespeare didn't make money from writing plays. He made money from being a theater owner, being a sharer in that building. That's where the money came from, because he got part of the box office every day. You write a play, they pay you once. You own a theater, you get money every day in the Renaissance. So it's pretty swell.
So that kind of, because he was an entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
and these expeditions were commercial, ventures. Do you think Shakespeare was aligned with the people who were also going over to the New World and publishing things about travel? Was relationship building for him with the right people? Is the first question. Why would the Tempest have been produced in the Royal Banqueting Hall? Also the inns at Temple, where the royalty would go see it. How did he bridge all of these, travel in all of these circles?
He would perform at Whitehall by invitation only. I mean, they were the king's men, but when the king wanted to see a play, the Master of Revels and some of the other people would decide which companies would be invited. And for something like the wedding of his daughter,
right,
lots and lots of companies performed. And Shakespeare's company performed more than one play. So and they're just assuming that the Tempest is one of the three that he was doing. But that in that sense of the company performed at the Globe in the summer and the Blackfriars, September to May. I mean, good weather, you're out of doors. Bad weather, you're inside. And bad weather, you've got a smaller theater, and the prices are 6 times as much. So you make money from the indoor theater. And the clientele is of a higher rank. And the very first traffic jam in the city of London was outside the Blackfriars Theater. Coaches picking up the muckety mucks from the theater, which I love.
And as far as the Tempest is concerned, it is a play that originally would have required a ceiling. You couldn't, because you need to have people flying through the air.
Well, there's a at the Globe and in
partial. And so, but I had been told that Blackfriars was better because you had a full ceiling to be able to
you could do
things, and the banqueting hall the same way. When we went in there, I looked at it, and it's a rectangle, and so I was trying to, it certainly looks like a theater, but it's in that shape. And so I imagine when I looked up at the ceiling of all sorts of pulleys and ropes and things like that someone would be using to fly through the air.
P.S.
Globe,
what else happened
everywhere? Yeah, I mean, in the rebuilt Globe in London, I've seen them fly on bungee cords out over the audience.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them in Pericles fly from every upright as mariners. It's just, I mean, you can get away with flying. If you want to fly, there's somebody who's going to figure it out. And that's, anyway, sorry, Mary, I interrupted. My bad.
No. I'm glad you said that, because I was moving on. I was just doing the sidebar. Do you know what other great possibly tragic historical event happened at the banqueting hall in Whitehall.
Someone
Not
lost their
long
head.
after that. It's where
Yeah.
King Charles I was beheaded.
Just outside of it. Yeah.
Out on the balcony.
Yeah.
Another kind of show. But it wouldn't have been, I'm just thinking about Shakespeare. I'm thinking about equivocation and how he used his position. He's friendly, obviously, with patrons who can afford to support him and pay for him. They all have business ventures that could stand to be promoted. He's got the ear of the queen, or in this case, the king. But we're just on a precipice. The Puritans have a lot of control in the city of London. And not long after this, there'll be a new king, and he's going to get beheaded. So how did Shakespeare, how did Stephen Hopkins walk this fine line and keep their heads on their shoulders and not get excommunicated? And I mean, there are all these organizations they have to appease along the way.
Yeah, well, I think the one thing you can take from this is that Stephen Hopkins, Stephano, is a survivor. Mm-hmm. He's able to, navigate all these tricky things. I mean, just the mere sense that you say to somebody today, you're compelled to go to a church service once a week, mm-hmm. and it has to be this exact church. The idea that things are so, that the religion especially is so very central to a community's identity. And it's
if you're not there, you pay a fine if you're not in church. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So and then if you miss more than that, then you're going to get in even more trouble. And don't even think about saying anything different than what is being set down. The level of control and conformity is I don't think we really have any experience with that level of control in the modern world outside of places like North Korea or such. So there's that. But so he's able to find ways to be able to do things, because I mean, what does he do? He ends up being the assistant to the minister. If he has such divergent viewpoints, and yet at the same time his skill is writing, he was able to keep his head down for the most part. But as soon as he raised any sort of objection whatsoever as to the structure of things, when they're on a desert island, he gets into trouble. Mm-hmm. So he survives. He survives Jamestown, which has had like a 90% mortality rate, mm-hmm. as well. I mean, that's just dodging disease.
Elements, right, and disease. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I asked everyone to have a question in their head, and now is a good time to ask it if we didn't get it accomplished in the course of our conversation. Does anyone have a question?
Okay.
I do. Oh, Eric, are you asking a question? No question. All right. It's about pigs and Bermuda.
How'd they get there?
The Spanish left them.
Spanish, that's right.
Were the pigs there when their ship crashed?
Yes.
And what did they eat?
Bruce?
Bermuda, Bermuda had a bad reputation. It was known as the Isle of the Devils because of all of the terrible surf and everything around it, and nobody wanted to go anywhere near it. And they were very fortunate because the ship drove up between rocks and it was held in place while everybody got off of it. And then they discovered it was still there after the storm. That's why they took everything off of it. But they land on this island and they discover it's got fresh water. It's got plants. It's got animals. It doesn't have any giant predators or anything. It's a paradise. It's a wonderful place. It had woods. As Andrew already said, one of the ships was made from wood they harvested from the Sea Venture. The other was made entirely of cedar grown naturally in Bermuda. They had good shipwrights with them, and they discovered, wow, this is really good stuff. Those boats didn't go to sea and sink. They lasted. They were great.
Yeah, and the other thing is that they had they had the pigs that had been tossed over the side by the Spanish, basically as food for shipwrecked sailors. And the Spanish had people wrecked there before, but there was no permanent settlement there. But the thing is, you've got all the fish all around. You've got the birds, certainly, and the birds' eggs, and you have sea turtles, and the sea turtles, it was said, could feed 30 people. But those sea turtles were referred to as moon cows.
Moon cows.
Oh, that is in the Tempest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Caliban.
Yeah.
That's how they refer to it. So the thing is that when people, Caliban has been portrayed anywhere from looking like a werewolf to looking like a fish, or he's half fish or something like that. But the ones that portray him as turtle, yeah, it's that may be as accurate as anything. But so the food, it was just the fact that they were coming from England, where people were, starvation was an ever-present danger, going to Jamestown, where people were running out of food so much that they were eating the dead. It's all of a sudden you're on Bermuda and everything's wonderful. Why would you ever want to leave this place?
Yeah.
So,
that is a beautiful. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but just a few years later, when word got back, all of a sudden everybody was let's settle Bermuda. There were within a few years, there were more people in Bermuda than there were in Jamestown.
Mm-hmm.
It's a better place to live.
Happier people too, I bet.
Oh, yeah.
That and happy. Well, I invite you all to come see Southwest Shakespeare's rendition of The Tempest by William Shakespeare and decide for yourselves if the moon cat looks like a turtle or a werewolf. I know what I think. Come see the show. It closes on March 19th. We are also running Farinelli and the King, which closes March 20th, both wonderful plays in Rep. If you go to our website, swshakespeare.org, you can click on a link and stream Andrew Buckley's wonderful film. Andrew is a fisherman in Cape Cod as well as a filmmaker, and all of the proceeds will go to the streaming platform and to him. So watch it early and often. We want to support this wonderful artist in your work. Thank you for bringing this history to light for us. It's a wonderful piece of history, real life, that melds into our artistic creative process, as Deborah Ann Bird said. And this is how we tell the story for future generations, so that they can know of the past when we become part of the dust. So thank you, everyone, to Megan, to Bruce, to Eric, to Andrew, to Deborah Ann, Susan Willis, and Ingrid Sonicson, who is listening offline, Bo Heckman, who is running the tech on this show. It's time to sign out. Hope to see you at the theater.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Andrew. I hope we can get together there or here one day.
Please get in touch with me, Mary. I hope you'll pass my contact information along, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I look forward to coming out there soon and catching your next, whatever's next for the company.
Come join us. We'd love it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, all.